Good morning, everybody, on IPE Day. My name is Nil Rusky, and I'm truly honored to introduce our distinguished speaker. And she is Dr. Aletha Maybank, who currently serves as the Chief Health Equity Officer and Group Vice President for the AMA, where she focuses on embedding health equity across all the work of the AMA and leading the Center for Health Equity. She joined the AMA almost 2 years ago in April 2019 to launch its Center for Health Equity and as the inaugural Chief Health Equity Officer. Prior to the AMA, she served as the founding Deputy Commissioner for the Center for Health Equity at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in 2014. Aimed at strengthening equity efforts and transforming organizational culture, the center became a true model of success, recognized by New York City leadership, the CDC, as well as the World Health Organization. She was instrumental in infusing equity at the neighborhood level and advancing the department's place-based approach to addressing health inequities. She also set precedents with groundbreaking work at the Office of Minority Health in the Suffolk County Department of Health Services in 2006, while serving as the founding director there. She has taught medical and public health students on diverse topics related to health inequities, public health leadership and management, physician advocacy, and community organizing in health. In 2012, along with a group of Black women physician leaders, Dr. Maybank co-founded We Are Doc McStuffins, a movement inspired by the Disney Junior character Doc McStuffins, serving to shine a light on the critical importance of diversity in medicine. She's highly sought after, as you likely know, health expert in media, appearing on multiple national and influential media outlets, NPR, MSNBC, News One, Roland Martin, The Lancet, the AMA, just to name a few. More recently, due to her leadership in the COVID response efforts, she's been interviewed by Oprah Winfrey and authored the New York Times op-ed, The Pandemic's Missing Data, to bring more awareness to the structural inequities in the US. She moderates the AMA biweekly web series, Prioritizing Equity, that elevates the voices and stories of physicians, centering equity in COVID-19 response efforts. Her qualifications, as you have heard, are impeccable. She holds a undergraduate degree from Johns Hopkins University, medical degree from Temple University, and an MPH from Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She's a pediatrician and preventive medicine public health physician. Again, Dr. Maybank, thank you, and it's an honor to have you give your presentation.
Great. Such an honor to be here with you all today and to be with Columbia students. I remember my time there very well and very fondly. And I feel like I have reaped many benefits from going to Columbia. So thanks again for the time and space. So I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully you all can see this. There we go. All right. So I'm going to talk about the work. So I've been doing this kind of work of operationalizing equity, more specifically, more so in my last role at the health department and here at the American Medical Association, but more specifically about, what are the actions that we have to do to actually meet this narrative and around and declaration around, that racism is a public health issue. I think it is on the forefront of many of our minds and spaces of those of us who are in health, whether it be public health or healthcare. And full disclosure, I am a public health person, quite obvious, by training, and have spent most of my years in work doing this in public health and in governmental public health more specifically. I've now kind of transitioned more so to the healthcare space, which has been extremely illuminating. However, illuminating in the sense of the need for public health and healthcare to come better together, which I'll talk about a little bit. So the American Medical Association, just so that you know, is an organization that was founded in 1847. So it's been a long-standing institution, and right now represents about 270,000 physicians across the country. It's about a fifth of the physician population. It is the largest physician organized body in the country, with lots of advocacy and voice in the federal and state levels, and a lot of action as it relates to removing barriers for physicians in the healthcare system, as well as working in the spaces of chronic disease, and as well as working a lot on medical education. And so I've been on board now, as was mentioned, for 2 years. And this was an ask of our House of Delegates, that, that the AMA has more intentional efforts and opportunities, and that they start a Center for Health Equity. And our role, and my role, is to ensure and facilitate a process to embed equity across the entire organization. So I'm going to speak to kind of, where we are at in that, but also connected to, what is happening in community. And as we go through, hoping that you also pick up on some strategies as it relates to getting and advancing equity and justice, because I think it's these strategies that are very critical to employ to do it. And oftentimes this is where the questions are. So first, I usually do center my conversations around honoring those who have been most marginalized in this country, but specifically our indigenous communities and people and leaders, and hearts and spirits that have survived and still thrive to this day. And then also for recognizing those families, individuals that were forced to this land for free labor, and the Africans that were forced to this land. This particular photo is Tulane, a bunch of Tulane medical students taken about 2 years ago. They visited Whitney Plantation, which is close to the school, recognizing that they stand on the shoulders of their ancestors. And I always give honor and recognition of all the folks who fought before me to open doors for many of us to be where we can be. But especially for me, as I do this work, it's really important that I continue to reflect on that, because it's that actually, it's that historical context that gives me hope to move forward and to continue forward. So in this time of COVID over the last year, I found this at the end of 2019, this slide. And, there was a lot of talk about how COVID really accelerated, to say the least, different types of transformation. So there's lots of talk about digital transformation and how, the landscape of that prior to COVID just seemed so far in the distance, and the vision of being able to achieve that seems so far in the future, rather. But the reality is COVID came around, and it happened pretty quickly when we think of telemedicine and telehealth and all the other virtual capacities that we have now. And I would say, and so I kind of put my own language in here, I think the same is for racism, and the opportunity is the same for how we talk about racism. That COVID-19, along with the public murder of George Floyd, really propelled many of our institutions into the space of naming racism, where racism before, was a very uncomfortable term for many people to even speak from their mouths. And it didn't matter who your background was or what your background was in terms of race and ethnicity or levels of power. A lot of people were very uncomfortable with saying the word racism, and I'm sure people are still uncomfortable to this day. However, we are at a point now where we do have, many entities now declaring racism as a public health issue. So looking at the right side of this, the American Public Health Association, and this is new, I actually recommend you all to kind of check it out on their website. They have pulled together all of the kind of public health institutions, the cities, the counties, the boards, state legislatures that have actually declared racism as a public health issue. And there's over, I think on this, it says over 190, so almost probably a little bit more than that, honestly, that have declared, racism as a public health issue. And then us in medicine and the healthcare side have also started to do that. And we have done that at the American Medical Association, which I'll come to a little bit later in the talk. And the challenge is, an opportunity is, now that we've named and organizations are naming racism, how do they move beyond just the declarative advocacy, as this article points out that I had the opportunity to co-write with some med students? How do we move beyond advocacy to actual praxis? And core to this, I think as we move forward in institutions, I think that there has to still be a lot of grounding and understanding about what racism is. So while folks are naming racism as a public health issue, I do have concerns about whether folks really, and leadership, really understands what racism is, how it's played out, its historical context, and its impacts to this day. And, you know, I usually use the definition on the bottom right-hand side as racism being a system of power and oppression that structures opportunities, excuse me, and assigns value based on skin color, unfairly disadvantaging people of color and unfairly advantaging whites. And there are varying levels of racism. I think this is very foundational in racism, and that there's plenty of evidence at this point in time that actually highlights all levels of racism, and has some analysis on racism. We need more. We need more empirical evidence about racism and its impact on health. But we do have enough data and evidence as a foundation to say that racism is a fundamental cause of why health inequities exist. And this is a paper that was done by Dr. Mary Bassett, who many of you know was former health commissioner. And I had the opportunity and privilege to work with her for the years that she was commissioner, as being the founding director and deputy commissioner of the Center for Health Equity. They released this paper in 2019, really highlighting, again, structural racism. So I named it before as a system, but structural racism being the ways in which historical and contemporary racial inequities and outcomes are perpetuated by social and economic political systems, including mutually reinforcing systems of healthcare, education, housing, employment, the media, criminal justice, and it relates to the systemic variation in our opportunity according to race. And what really I think points out, and based on who I'm speaking with today on this call, is that all of us have a piece in this. All of us have an opportunity in this context of what do we do and how do we name racism, but what do we do about undoing racism, and what are our anti-racism strategies moving forward? It's not just the healthcare sector's job. It's not just health education. It's not just housing, et cetera. And I think also really critical from my lessons that I'm learning over the last few years, but especially this year, is that we not only have to name racism as a system, we have to go even higher or deeper in our analysis, and really naming the systems of supremacy clearly from the global context of colonization, I think is absolutely critical, but also the systems of supremacy and white supremacy and male supremacy, patriarchy and human supremacy. That's the fuel for racism as a system. And if we don't name that as well, we are going to miss, again, opportunities and strategy, and opportunities as it relates to really fully naming the problem in order to do something better and different. And I think connected to that then is the impact that the fuel of supremacy has for the system of racism, and how that causes trauma across generations and across communities, but also specifically then kind of impacts and is embodied in terms of inflammation, changing of the way our genes are expressed, increasing our stress loads and hormones in our bodies, that all can lead to inequities at the individual level, clearly then at the community and neighborhood level. And racism actually could be interchanged with class oppression as well as gender oppression as well. All of them lead to chronic stress that have impacts on the body. In doing this work, and for me, really intentionally, we do a lot in the education space. As you all are, looking at history and understanding history, you're looking at charts and graphs. It's absolutely critical to remember that this is violence upon the body, and that it's a visceral experience. It's not just something that lives in charts and regressions, as says in this quote by Coates, but it actually has impact, and it's actually violence upon the body, the impacts of racism and white supremacy. I think this sometimes gets lost in conversations. I've been in many conversations lately that intellectualize harm and not really speaks to what is happening to not only just the physical body, but the mind and the spirit of communities and people over generations. Our code of ethics, especially in the medical side, but I think as all health professionals, is do no harm. And so I elevate this particular example. Many of you may be familiar and may have heard about 2 weeks ago, JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, that has editorial independence, posted a podcast with a conversation between two white men who really had no expertise or experience in talking about racism. And it was extremely harmful and extremely exhausting, having to deal with kind of the aftermath of all of that. There's an excellent piece by Clarence Gravely that I highly recommend folks to check out, that had a great kind of analysis of what's happening. But again, moving beyond just the system of racism, but talking about the impacts of white supremacy. And I go back to, thinking about as I'm going through this experience myself and helping to support our teams across the AMA and speaking to many on the outside of the organization, and just kind of the sheer, to the point of the first quote, the time and the energy that is taken, the waste that really accumulates as a result of racism, and the waste of human resources has to be on the top of mind as we do this work. And to remember that our cause is really, again, to do no harm. And it's not, I just also want to elevate that for me, it's not a problem that two white men had this conversation. It was the problem that was two white men who had no expertise in this space of racism and anti-racism. I think there are enough men, white men, who understand the context of anti-racism and are experts in the space, and who could have that conversation, but that's not what happened here. So as we move forward in this work, a lot of what I've been engaged with over the last 15 years has been a lot around, again, supporting institutions from the inside so that they could do the outside kind of external work of equity. I don't believe that if we don't challenge our own mental models as employees, as staff, as learners within a space on the inside of the organization, if we haven't figured out equity as it relates to the workforce, as it relates to pay, as it relates to contracting, then it's really, we're not being completely genuine in how we engage on the outside of the institution. And those are the technical pieces that I'm very involved in how to go about doing that. And I'll talk about in a second. But there's a part before that that I think is really critical, and it has to do with kind of our narratives, how we talk about people, how we understand people, and the values that are connected to them. And there are many narratives that are kind of malignant or dominant in our society that really reinforce, the negative connotations and understandings and explanations of communities that aren't helpful and actually undermine equity. And oftentimes they obscure power as well as responsibility. And here are some of the narratives, just to go into it a little bit more deeply. Dr. Kamara Jones talks a lot about this as value targets, that if we don't challenge these particular value targets on a constant basis, it's going to be really hard to achieve equity. Notions of that race and class inequities are unfortunate. Self-determining individuals make right or wrong choices. So this concept and the myth of individualism without contextualizing what is happening in the environment, the social and structural and drivers of health and health inequities. The blaming of people, for their poorer health, that kind of happened in the context of COVID, especially initially when a lot of the media came out. It was really focused on underlying conditions of Black and Brown communities and how they had worse diabetes and heart disease, but limited conversation initially how folks of Black and Brown communities are rendered to positions and jobs that force them into essential worker opportunities that expose them to COVID and more likely to die of COVID. Picking yourself up by your bootstraps and the myth of meritocracy, American exceptionalism, zero-sum game, and then lastly, what I mentioned earlier, the hierarchy of human value based on skin color. All of these, if you Google Dr. Jones, Kamara Jones, you can find out more information about that. So as a Center for Health Equity, I said we've been around for 2 years. We really work to kind of embody what I just stated before. And we have several approaches that we're moving forward in order to advance this work. And that's embedding equity into all of our practices organizationally, building alliances and sharing power for meaningful engagement, ensuring equitable opportunities and innovation, of which many times marginalized and minoritized people have been excluded from, pushing upstream to address all determinants of health, and creating pathways for truth, reconciliation, and healing for AMAs past. And so I'll go into a little bit of each one of these. So the embedding equity, Again, this is really critical, as I mentioned before, to doing this work and driving it at an institutional level. We have to work on what is self-reflection, and that's for any of us, in order to change society. And so our overall kind of inside outside strategy and theory of change around that, I mentioned earlier, on the left-hand side, we have to work at embedding racial equity and social justice, as well as gender equity, within these core components of our organization. Now, this is really rooted for the American Medical Association, but many of the categories are very similar to any institution that we have. Most institutions have things around organizational commitment and leadership, workforce equity, engagement and partnerships, internal and external communication, data collection and metrics and budgets and contracting. We at AMA also have advocacy, publishing, and innovation. But the point is that we have to actually take each one of those and understand where there may be gaps in embedding equity and what we need to do in terms of solutions. And so this will inform our policies, our programs, services, research and evaluation, and culture, I think most importantly, of which all of those stream from as well. And this is how we get to the outcomes. Our theory is how we get to the outcomes that we are looking to get towards. For us, again, this is internally I'm talking about right now. I gave kind of the mission statement earlier in terms of our kind of external overall, but internally, we're very clear that if employees themselves, don't have the experience of just treatment as it relates to equitable policies, they aren't satisfied, there isn't a sense of true belonging, we can't fully carry forward our mission. We as AMA added to our enterprise values explicitly equity. And at the bottom, it's where we center the voices of those most marginalized in shaping policies and practices towards improving the health of not only just the nation, but also what is happening within our institution as well. We are using an impact model that comes from Race Forward, which is the largest racial justice organization in the country. And they are partnered with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. Again, you can look them up, but they have the strategy of normalizing, organizing, and operationalizing. This is the same model that I use at the New York City Department of Health. And normalizing is really about how do you build a shared analysis, but what is your process to do that? Oftentimes that is where the training comes into play. People do need training. They need knowledge building and they need skill building in order to change behavior. But it's also about creating spaces of which folks can have conversations that may not be comfortable, but at least there's some level of safety within that conversation. And so there's more and more that has to be done around that. Then organizing is kind of how do we engage different people across the organization in order to move the work? It's the same kind of organizing principle that we do kind of in the outside and with communities as well. We have to do that internally within the organization. Then operationalizing, or what are the tools that people need in order to really change the work that they're doing and challenge again their day-to-day mental models and how they show up. So this could be we're working on a communications and narrative guide for our teams, and there will be many tools that are created over time. And then lastly, inside, which I think is really critical. So in addition to visualize, we have to have trauma-informed supports. Doing this work at the institutional level, disrupting culture can feel really hard for folks. And we have to ensure that we have to do our best not to re-traumatize people and not to create new trauma. And so you have to be very intentional about trauma-informed supports in a way of doing this work that builds people and builds the organization up and as we're going through this disruptive time. In normalizing, just so that folks know, for us as the AMA, it has been a requirement, and Jim Madera is our CEO of the AMA, and he has required, that all vice presidents and above, we have about 60 of them, had to take this 2-day racial equity training. We're now actually have expanded in about a third of the entire organization. So we have 1,100 employees that work on behalf of the membership. So we have the 270,000 members. They pass policy, and then it's our job to execute on that policy, to put those policies into action. So it's very critical that the 1,100 management team has the expertise and the knowledge and the skills to actually do racial equity work and equity work overall. So we're working on helping to support our teams. This is not meant to be confusing. It would be confusing though if you're looking from the outside. The whole point of this is of organizing is to say there has to be accountability within the institution. Good intention is just good intention. It's that. But it doesn't necessarily translate to impact. And you don't know if you're going to have impact or even get to the point of impact if you don't do what you set out to do and hold yourself accountable to it. And so what has been very critical is that you have to set up these structures of accountability. So the levels that, are kind of just focusing on the action plan development part is that we have a health equity work group in which we have representation of all the business units. In that work group, we have a business unit action team. So at the very most local level of the organization, they have equity action teams in which they're thinking about culture and taking that model that I shared before and how they're implementing at the business unit. And then we have cross-enterprise work groups in these areas of workforce, contracting, and communications to really think more broadly about the entire organization and how to change in these key 3 areas. And that's a very inclusive body of folks made up from across the organization. And so we help support manage all of that at the Center for Health Equity. But it's really critical that we have these levels of infrastructure and then accountability with full senior management. Other levels of accountability, we've had an equity and engagement survey, which has proven really useful in understanding the experience of all employees. And we've disaggregated the data based on people with disabilities, based on race and gender, tenure in the organization, location. We're a national organization, so we're located in several places across the country. And then also accountability is now there are requirements for all of our staff and teams to have objectives or task and standards as well as performance factors that explicitly name the work that they're doing in equity. And as I mentioned, we're working on tools. What are tools that need to be present and available to folks? This is taken from, and you can look this up, the Racial Equity Toolkit from the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. I think to me, my kind of favorite questions out of these are, who benefits and who will be burdened by your proposal or whatever it is that you're putting forward or decision that you're making at the health system level, whether it's in public health or healthcare, or the community that you're looking to impact, whether it's internal or external, and what are the strategies for mitigating unintended consequences. All these questions are critical questions to think through and answer as you start to do your work. And I think over time, we've used this extensively in the New York City Department of Health when I was there, and over time it became kind of habit for folks to engage in this kind of way. So again, we're at the point now of building these tools in the New York City Department of Health. Another important context, I think, to advancing racial equity and justice is understanding that there is a tremendous gap in the narrative in this country around what creates health in the first place. Folks who are in public health, who are in social work, you all get the kind of the broad scope usually of what creates health because that's how you're taught. It's what we're taught on. But there is definitely the gap in healthcare, and healthcare has had tremendous power in terms of financially and political power over the years. And I think that's helped really determine why the narrative has been mostly focused on the healthcare system in this country and not beyond that in terms of the impacts on health. And I think there's definitely more movement and more work. I think there's a greater consciousness around the healthcare space of what people use the social determinants of health or the social drivers of health, and there's more awareness around that. And so I think part of the work that we're doing is really building out and really trying to work and embed into many different areas, whether it's medical education, the payment delivery system, or the payment system, the delivery system, all have the ability to really understand this full context of what creates health and then be able to respond to it. And that's going to take some time, some definite political will to do that, but that's what we're pushing forward. In the medical community, just to say, and this is the opportunities again that I see for public health and the medical communities to better come together and the need for it. I think COVID just definitely exemplifies the need, one, for the building of the public health infrastructure and the financial support needed for the public health infrastructure to strengthen, but just the idea of greater coordination between the two. Most of healthcare still sits on the left side of this graph. focusing on the social needs. At least they're getting there, of focusing on social needs and being responsive to that. But we know we need to move greater upstream and have a greater consciousness around that. So that requires education. And so we're working on creating curriculums. We're working in partnership with the American Association of Medical Colleges, who is working on and taking the lead of developing competencies and standards for equity, diversity, and inclusion, but as well as, more specifically around anti-racism. But we know we need to train not only and help support the preclinical student and the medical students, but all the way up to attending physicians as well. So it's work that we're starting to build. We're going to be launching very shortly a health equity education center where any specialty could come and get CMEs or continuing education credits for varying aspects of equity. And we've had some unique content that we're creating. And then we're also partnering with folks who have already created really exceptional content to help kind of populate the space in partnership, and that partnership is recognized so that we don't reinvent the wheel and waste time. We have now just also launched a medical justice and advocacy fellowship. Applications are due this week for physicians who are really interested in advancing racial and health justice in their own communities. They're just, there are many physicians who are in practice who were not in school in times when, social justice was being taught, or social medicine was being taught, or health equity was being taught, anything related to that. And so we're trying to work our best to kind of increase that capacity, as well as increase the capacity of physicians to be able to do organizational change work. We are also, in terms of moving upstream, and I think this is where the greatest opportunity always rests in order for different kind of disciplines, but different types of communities, in quotes. And communities, I don't just mean Black and brown communities, but I mean healthcare institutions and businesses and faith-based organizations are able to come together to work to advance equity and justice at the neighborhood level. So the AMA, I'm going to say we kind of represent the healthcare space, has for the first time started to invest in Chicago, where the headquarters is located, in the West Side, where there's a tremendous life expectancy gap. And we have partnered with 6 other healthcare institutions and have contributed several millions of dollars to focus on what's on the left-hand side and support community development financial institutions on upstream opportunities within the neighborhoods, knowing and understanding and hoping that there's going to be social impacts and impacts related specifically to health. And you can imagine where, there's a lot of kind of development around. So how do you really measure that? And how do you really know that this work is going to create change? This is a unique partnership too. I think the mayor's office is engaged in it, the health department is engaged, and the healthcare institutions. And I think this is what we really need to work more towards. And I know there are plenty of examples in New York City because I've been there in doing some of this work, but I do think there's a little level of uniqueness to what's happening in the West Side. And because they were already kind of convened and working together prior to COVID, when COVID came around, they were able to utilize, and the mayor's office was able to call upon the leaders of the West Side United effort, who are community-based folks, to help support leading racial equity rapid response teams, not only in the West Side Chicago, but the South Side of Chicago. So it created almost like this opportunity for emergency preparedness that folks didn't even realize or think of. I would say the next frontier, one of the next frontiers, is specifically in the healthcare side, because I know there are several folks in disciplines that are in specifically healthcare, is how do we really operationalize the equity part of this definition of quality that was really left off the table for many years. And there's a national alignment between safety and equity that I think we should absolutely capture. I have just brought on another vice president, Karthik Sivasankar, who's a physician that comes from the Brighams, who has lots of expertise in implementing and embedding equity via quality and safety systems, and looking at, to integrate equity into all quality, safety, risk analysis, using equity informed quality, safety education, using data to support equity improvement, leadership awareness and engagement, and then lastly, organizational accountability, these being the 5 drivers of safety and equity within an institution. So what we're clear about is that there's not a lot out there to help support institutions to do this. And so we're working to do that more. On the space of equity and innovation, I mentioned earlier, my experience in starting at the AMA is that there were many folks who were reaching out of color to say, you know, I can't get funded. I have this idea. I don't have access. And the reality is that the innovation space within healthcare and the way that it's defined is predominantly white and male. It is very exclusionary. And so we are working with some outside experts at the intersection of equity, racial justice, social justice to help inform our strategy. This is kind of one of our newer strategies and approaches that we're working towards building. So more to come on that. I think critical to advancing racial justice is also how do we build alliances and share power. So we as AMA, you know, it's considered a pretty powerful institution because of its finances, as well as because of its political kind of connection and advocacy. And, you know, we have a history, which I'll go into a little while, of excluding Black physicians. And it's the reason why the National Medical Association was actually created, which is on the very far right-hand side at the bottom. And so when I came on board, I thought it was very important, and I'm an NMA member as well, but that we work collaboratively with these groups and in coalition, and without the expectation they would have to support or provide any kind of financial contribution, because their contributions are actually their expertise, their knowledge, their access to communities of color, and that would be a way for us to move forward as AMA. And so we have launched this campaign called Release the Pressure, specifically focused on high blood pressure. It's a partnership with Essence as well. And it's not just about high blood pressure and getting pledges and around high blood pressure and improving that for Black and Brown communities, but there are also other vehicles. This provides a vehicle in to talk about and discuss, you know, information as it relates to COVID and other opportunities that may arise, you know, over time. So we're working and building that out. To talk a little bit more specifically about COVID and what else we've done, you know, in terms of advancing equity, is one, just having resources available on our AMA website page, publishing and using our voice. I've seen during this time more healthcare professionals of color, and just in general, not even just of color, more healthcare professionals in the space of media during this time of COVID than ever before. And I hope that sustains and remains even post-COVID. I think our voice is absolutely critical, whether it's print media or the, you know, oral media, verbal media. I think our presence is critical. We launched a series that was mentioned in the introduction on prioritizing equity that has many folks from marginalized communities and leaders and healthcare specialties to talk about what are they seeing and the issues they're seeing. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, there have been many people who have reached out and wanted to know, so what are folks doing across the country as it relates to employing equity strategies? And so we started to gather examples of what people are doing, and we've posted some of them on our website as well. And lastly, I think during this COVID time, it was very clear that we as the AMA had a tremendous gap in how we were engaging with Latinx patients as well as physicians. And so we now have an AMA language spokesperson, Dr. Diana Ramos, who has been great. And we also issued a report just on the status of what is happening with Latinx patients across the country. So lastly, my last approach is really talking about, you know, truth, reconciliation, and healing, or restorative justice, you know, for the past and the harms that we have done. What is now going to be really helpful for us to be able to do this kind of boldly and directly? This past fall, because of the tremendous advocacy of our medical students, who are absolutely amazing, and our minority affairs section, we passed and adopted 3 policies. One is naming racism as a public health threat. 2 is ridding our healthcare system of racial essentialism. And 3 is support with the elimination of race as a proxy for ancestry, genetics, biology, and med ed research and clinical practice. And so this will help provide a foundation for how we can talk about and really dig deep in this work, because I'm very clear. I don't think we can have be really committed to anti-racism work without an honest assessment of our own history as AMA and present practices. And a lot of folks point their fingers to AMA, and it's warranted in terms of the history. It's been well documented, and it's there, and it's been harmful. However, I just want to say that most historically white institutions in this country, and that's the majority of them, academic institutions, healthcare institutions, public health institutions, have to all dig into their history, because most likely there's some relationship that they have had either with the folks within their walls or outside of their walls in the neighborhoods that they've served, or even broader than that, especially a place like Columbia that has many, many leaders that have influenced not just the space of Columbia, but the field of health overall. We have to dig into that history and see how potentially our decisions may have harmed communities as well as excluded communities over the years. And there are some of the examples here on this slide that I'll share, and I'll go into a few of them in a second. And so this restorative justice process, this telling the truth, and listening to others, acknowledging our wrongs, and then finding the space of what it means to heal is going to be a critical intentional step for us at the AMA. And we've started to kind of lay the foundations to do that. We did issue an apology in 2008, our former president, Ron Davis, and this was to specifically acknowledge and apologize our exclusion of Black physicians. And in it, he mentions the power to right the wrongs of the past, and two, that this would be only our first step toward healing and reconciliation. And so we need to continue on this journey with great intention. Earlier this year, so the Center for Health Equity, the evolution of that continues on the journey. The passing of the policies that I mentioned continues us on the journey. And then just about a little over a month ago, our CEO, again, Jim Madera, who I mentioned earlier, wrote an op-ed and an AMA viewpoint about reckoning with medicine's history of racism. And in this, and in his experience and his story, he talks about reading articles that were actually co-published between AMA and JAMA a few years back that really spoke to the role that Nathan Davis, who's considered the father of AMA, had in explicitly saying that AMA should exclude women as well as Black physicians from representation of their House of Delegates. And when he read that and realized the tremendous role that Davis had, it was of the request of the CEO, Jim Madera, that we had a display on one of the floors of the American Medical Association, and that it be removed from public view and placed into archives and serve as educational material. And then additionally, they also, at the same time, the Board of Trustees, along with Jim Madera, removed the name of Nathan Davis from an award. And again, small steps, but really important steps to beginning to reconcile the past. And the next areas that we're going to have to move on to are kind of the impact of the Flexner report, which some of you may have heard of. But this was a report that was published in 1910 that did an assessment of medical schools across the country. There was probably a level of reality as well as belief that the medical schools that were all present did not have enough rigor and academic rigor. And AMA commissioned Abraham Flexner and commissioned this report. Abraham Flexner, along with the support of the Carnegie Foundation, to do an investigation and assessment of all the med schools across the country. One of their key recommendations was, one, closing down all the women med schools, or 3 of them at the time, and then recommending that 5 of the 7 Black med schools shut down. And so they did, and that has had tremendous impact even to this day on the ability of, or the lack of diversity rather, at the medical school level in this country. This is a report that was done in 2020, published in JAMA, on projected estimates if those schools had not been closed down, and anywhere upwards of 35 to 40,000 more Black physicians would be present if those schools were not shut down. The women's schools, we actually have reached parity in terms of women because of really totally blanking my mind. Affirmative action. Affirmative action really was to great benefit for women, and especially white women, in schools and in many arenas across the country. And so for that reason, we've had tremendous parity. But for Blacks, and especially Black males, we have not achieved that at all in med school. The other root of some of our harm is our former president, J. Marion Sims. This is more familiar to a community like New York City, because there was a statue of J. Marion Sims that was across the street in Central Park, across the street from the New York Academy of Medicine on the east side, Upper East Side, a little bit beyond the Upper East Side, a little more like lower Harlem, and sorry, the Upper West Side. I'm sorry, I'm getting my New York City confused. But what's important about his history is that he did procedures on women who were enslaved without anesthesia. And he was lauded by the American Medical Association for all of his achievements. He helped create the speculum, the vaginal speculum that is used still to this day. And it was revered in many different ways. And so it was the recommendation by the city with a commission, I think it was back in 2018, that this particular statue of Sims be removed. So in the middle of the picture is myself, Harriet Washington, who wrote the book Medical Apartheid, who really elevated the story of Sims to many of us. And then on the right-hand side in the picture, the woman there and leader is Dr. Lynn Roberts, who is co-founder of the reproductive justice movement. So we were all there. I was in there in my capacity of being a deputy commissioner when the statue came down. To the far right, and this really speaks and goes back to the context of how we understand and talk about disparities and inequities and justice. Again, that it moves beyond just the graphs and all the charts that we have, and the harm that it causes people in a very spiritual and heart feeling kind of way. We were standing there, and there was a woman who was jogging past, and she jogs past her every day, she said, and she tapped me on my shoulder and she said, I just can't believe that this is coming down. I didn't know who she was. And she just asked if she could have a hug for the joy and the sadness and the joy that she felt at that moment, but the relief as well, that she didn't have to run by this every single day. And this is where, again, I think we have to really elevate and listen to the stories. If we want to center and operationalize equity, we have to hear the stories of people. We need to absorb the stories of people that we are engaged in, the stories of ourselves that may have been marginalized as well, to really help and center and guide where we need to move forward. So whose work is this? This brings me to, there's been a lot of conversations around allies and allyship. And I was on a pretty powerful call the other day. And, you know, the bottom line is, you know, we all have our work to do in this space. I personally, you know, it's not that I don't think allies are important. I just need people to show up and do the work and do the work in collaboration and coordination. I need accomplices. I need co-conspirators to do this. And this can't only be the work and burden of Black and Brown people within our institutions and within our communities. We all show up in that definition of racism and the historical context of it. And truthfully, if in reading the piece that I mentioned earlier by Lance Gravely, you know, whiteness is perpetuated by whiteness. And so it really takes the leadership of all of us to come forward and do this work. I think we're at an opportune time. You know, there are many opportunities for alignment that are existing right now on realities of alignment. At the federal level, we have the executive order on advancing racial equity and support of underserved communities throughout the entire federal government, and they're working towards figuring out how to do that in the time that is existing. Because what I'm very clear of is sometimes when these political and policy doors open and opportunities, they also can close just as quickly, and that can happen at many levels. And then there's this bill that's kind of on the floor now, the anti-racism bill in public health. and we think about the opportunities and advocacy that we can do as institutions, and your many different institutions you may be a part of, how are we supporting more sustainability and depth and investment in anti-racism is ever critical. And then lastly, just to end, I've learned, and I'm sure many of you have learned, that silence it doesn't help. I understand different risks based on different organizations we may be in, different positions of power, and how that determines how we speak up and communicate. However, I just encourage us to figure out and find that voice, and to know that you don't have to have that voice in isolation, that the same way people organize outside of institutions, you can organize inside of institutions as well to create change. But the meaningful part, and I think at this point in time, if we don't speak up about injustice, about white supremacy, about racism, we lose this moment. So I just encourage you all to continue to speak forward and to speak boldly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maybank. Hi, everyone. Some of the questions are coming into Q&A. My name is Ray Diakwa, she, her, hers. I'm the Assistant Dean of Diversity at Mailman School of Public Health and an Assistant Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences. I'm going to start with some of the questions that are popping up in the chart, up in the Q&A box thing. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature. So I'm going to start with a question from Claire Miller, because it directly relates to the removal of historical monuments. Claire Miller says, I commonly hear the argument that removing history, such as the Davis statue, is only removing culture and not doing much of anything. I have difficulty being able to have a discussion with someone when this argument is brought up, because the only answer I have is small steps will eventually equal big changes. How do you suggest navigating these conversations as we move into a professional setting?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think it has to be evaluated on case-to-case basis. But what I will say, and I'll bring up two examples. So I'll bring up Davis first. I think the way to have the conversation is that we aren't working to erase history. We aren't working to erase the harm, or where we want to erase the harm. I'm not saying like the actual harm that happens. We don't want harm to continue happening, but we don't want to erase the context that harm did happen as it relates to these structures, that are there in place, and the actions of people, because then removing it, then invisibilizes it, and then that's my made up word, and then has the opportunity to repeat itself again, right? Because we haven't learned from our past actions. And so it's really critical that we acknowledge the harm, the hurt, we remove it, from visible sight, because oftentimes the physical ability to be able to see something, experience something over and over again for marginalized communities just continues to harm. So that's why we want to kind of put it away somewhere. And we also want to acknowledge that it exists wherever it is that we put it away, and oftentimes provide some level of education about that history, and why it was removed and what that history was. Like, I think all of those are important components. And I think about that even, with the podcast that was, from last week from JAMA, rightfully so, a good amount of people haven't heard it because it was taken down immediately. And that choice to take it down immediately was really to prevent further harm, because listening to it, it's pretty traumatic. And at the same time, we will need to figure out, how do we still acknowledge what happened, and create some level potentially of some access around that, in the way that people usually go and interact with archives, but for educational purposes, and there's something connected to that. So all those things have to be worked out, but that's usually how I kind of frame it, in those three ways of why we have to preserve, in one sense, the history, but not the harm part of it.
Thank you. I have a question that comes out of the Medical Justice and Advocacy Program, the fellowship that you talked about earlier. So one of the aims of the program is to mobilize the next generation of advocacy leaders by sharing foundational tools, skills, and knowledge with them, right? What are the ways of being that the next generation of leaders need to be thinking about as it relates to this work? This work has been especially traumatizing and subtractive for people of color. And in a lot of ways, you often see people kind of reifying the same ways of being that are attached to these systems of oppression. And so the question is, what are the ways of being that the next generation of leaders need to know in doing anti-racist work?
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question, and even one that I think that I'm still, figuring out and grappling with. So what I would say in terms of a way of being, what we need to figure out, and I think again about how Ida B. Wells is one of those folks that are the kind of like always there in my spirit. I don't know why, but she's always there. And I think about doing justice work for the necessity of it, the obligation of it, the responsibility of it. And what is the opportunity? Because what we don't fully absorb about kind of dominant culture is the joy and the experiences that they can have enjoy. And so how do we, as a way of being, and I think, women of color, and I think about these last 2 weeks, I've been stressed, it's been a lot. And so, but how do we allow ourselves to also be in this space of justice and have and experience joy and, some level of a space where we can have some peace and some calm all in and at the same time. And I don't think we afford ourselves and I'm talking from as a Black woman specifically, but we don't afford ourselves oftentimes that space to do both. And I think in order to have sustainability in this space that allows us to remain healthy physically, mentally, and spiritually, we need to figure out that way of being. And we deserve to have that way of being as we show up as leaders.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take a question from Isa Rodriguez. Isa, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, your first name. Isa asks, how do you begin to address this in more conservative fields where people are less willing to participate in dismantling systemic racism or even acknowledge its existence?
Yeah, good question as well. And it's I can only go by my experience. AMA is a conservative space. Bottom line, healthcare is more conservative than public health is. But AMA is conservative. What I've aired on right now, of what's really worked for me is to really strengthen my analysis, honestly, about like what is happening, so that I can communicate and articulate it and also like counter it in the moment that it's happening, in a way that for me, what works is, I can be direct, and I there's a privilege, I guess, that I have to it, because one, I'm hired to do this work, and two, I do have a CEO that allows me the space and has said to me, my job is to allow you to use your voice and to protect you in that space. And so I do have a little bit more, I guess, I don't know if privilege is the right word, but I definitely have greater opportunity to be that direct. But I think but what I've learned that in order to be that direct, I have to be really sharp on kind of my analysis and how I communicate around that. And then really courageous in kind of stopping people at those moments when I feel when I know gaslighting is happening, and not let it fester on, whether immediately in a conversation or related to the situation. Mm-hmm. And that takes energy for sure, and leads to exhaustion. But that's how I've had to kind of work through that.
So I have just received the go ahead that we can go to 12:05 or 12:10 if needed. I'm going to let you all know that I will be taking that opportunity because there are some great questions here. We'll go to 12:05. Is that okay?
Yeah, I probably can only go because I have back-to-back meetings. So that's the challenge. So I apologize for not being able to stick too much longer.
Okay, that's
I
okay.
do
So
have a
just
meeting.
3 more minutes.
Okay, great.
All right, here's a good question from Sabrina Paulette Hyman. Are there any tools available to help institutions in creating a framework for accountability on how an implemented innovation for advancing equity is going? And if so, are there any that provide immediate feedback?
Yeah, there really aren't that many tools. I would say the best tool out there in terms of just a racial equity tool and in how you can evaluate your innovation is the one that I mentioned in the deck from Race Forward. I mean, from sorry, GARE, the Government Alliance for Racial Equity. Their racial equity toolkit, I think, is a pretty good tool and a pretty good framework on and a set of questions around what to do. And then they also kind of lead a little bit into how to create goals and metrics around in order to kind of help with that accountability piece as well. But you know, there really just isn't a lot yet, truthfully. You know, there's not a lot of evidence yet that's been built. So, you know, I have this role, right? It's kind of interesting. You know, I have this is my third time doing this. What's the evidence base behind having this role? I have no idea, you know, and I think we have to work towards building that, not just the role, but really the work, right? It's in the work of doing the internal work around anti-racism praxis, but also externally and how it impacts externally. And so that's what I would really encourage, that as folks start to embark on doing this, that they also are thinking about research and development and all those types of opportunities at the same time, so that we can begin to build the evidence base. There's lots of pressure now on journals. We have the example of Health Affairs, who actually now is going through a pretty rigorous process to figure out how do they better engage and embrace with racism, and really publishing pieces that are meaningful to advance the evidence. And so they've engaged with a whole bunch of stakeholders around that. But I think there's going to be more and more pressure upon those who are putting that evidence forward and publishing that evidence to do better, but they need the evidence in order to publish it. So that's upon us who are doing, if we're doing the programmatic work, to make sure that we're doing research and setting it up and partnering with people who know how to do it.
Of course. And to close us out, a last question from Sarmad Akach. Do you have any advice for medical residents, and I would say students broadly in the health professions, to balance wanting to speak out about racism that they have been subjected to by their own medical institutions with the fear of reprisal?
Yeah, and it's a fair question. So while I said I've been direct, you know, we have Dr. Aisha Corey, who, you know, many have probably heard about her case in California, you know, who spoke up and, you know, appears to be significantly retaliated against. So I get the fear and the risk in doing that. This is why I recommend to operate collectivity, to be collective in how you engage in your institution, and find those other folks. And so I could say allies. When I say allies, people kind of understand what I'm saying. But I mean, find those other accomplices from all backgrounds that can come together with you to put forward recommendations for your institution. So it's not just you alone. And document everything, and communicate things in more visible ways, also as a strategy.
Thank you, Dr. Maybank, for your time. I want to thank all of you for attending and for sharing your questions. We are going to sign off now. I know everyone has a packed schedule today. Hopefully we can get to some of the other questions later as well in another format. Again, thank you, and we are signing off.
Great, thank you.